Good morning and welcome to our Sunday morning sermon for Black Rock Baptist Church for September the 18th. And we're beginning this morning a series of messages on the book of Daniel. We're going to take a quick view of the book of Daniel, which will take us probably 6 or 7 weeks, up to 2 months to go through this. And as we look at these challenges that Daniel was faced with, Daniel and his friends, we will learn some things about how God works in our lives. So we're going to begin with Daniel chapter 1 this morning. And I want to talk to you this morning about serving the Babylons of life. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put the treasure in the house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of the court officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men who had no physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude in any kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they would enter the king's service. Among these were some men from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official among them gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel and the other three, he said, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and more nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in to the chief official, he brought them before Nebuchadnezzar and presented them to the king. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, or Azariah, and they entered the king's service. In every manner of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enhancers in the whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. We're going to focus this morning on this first chapter of the book of Daniel, surviving in the Babylons of life. Have you ever found yourself in the midst of an unexpected time of crises in your life? One of those times when the nightmares of life hit you and you never saw them coming. You never realized they were on their way. Well, today we're going to begin this study on the book of Daniel, and we're looking at a truly remarkable young man who was forced to deal with an unexpected crisis early on in his life. And of course, I'm referring to the prophet Daniel, who was taken from his own homeland into captivity in the land of Babylon. He's only 13 or 14 years old at this point. And when I say remarkable, I mean he's remarkable because Daniel is an amazing guy. He was literally the best that Judah had to offer. He was the cream of the crop. The words of verses 3 and 4 of our text paint a very thorough picture of just how remarkable Daniel was. First, these verses say he was from a family of high social status, part of the royal family itself. He was physically flawless, no doubt a consequence of the fact that his family was wealthy. So Daniel would have had good clothes. He would have had the best food. He lived in a nice home. I don't know about you, but when I read about Daniel, I picture kind of a young Brad Pitt. But even better than that, because Daniel was not only good looking, but he was intelligent. He was bright. He was quick to understand things. Here's another thing. The Bible says he was qualified to serve in the king's palace, which meant that he had a high level of what we might call emotional intelligence or people smarts. In other words, Daniel knew how to read people. He knew how to communicate with people. People of all temperaments, he could get along with them. Let me put it this way. He had the rare and gracious give and take personality that made him very good at dealing with difficult people. But best of all, Daniel was a godly young man, absolutely devoted to the Lord and to his people. Put all these characteristics together, and it's easy to conclude that Daniel was a unique individual. He was a very special person. Gene Getz puts it this way in his book. He says, Daniel is one of the few principal characters of the Old Testament concerning whom there is not one word of criticism. Now, like all young men his age, Daniel had dreams of how he thought his life was going to proceed and how it was going to turn out. And coming from nobility as he did, well, he would have assumed that his dreams were almost certain to come true. Daniel would get a great education under the best teachers of his day. And then he would go on to great success in whatever field he would choose. He'd meet the right girl and build a great marriage. He'd live in an enviable and a wonderful home. He'd raise a wonderful family. He'd occupy a place of prominence in God's temple. In short, Daniel would be what we would call today an overachiever. He would do things for God and for God's people. He would be a leader in his homeland, someone who was looked up to, someone who was very much admired. But life didn't turn out that way. It didn't turn out the way that Daniel was planning his life to turn out. The unexpected came. And you can almost feel the heartbreak that comes with verses 1 and 2, where it says that Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, to put it in proper context, let me take you through a very quick review of Hebrew history up to this point. And I do mean quick here. But the Hebrew people became a nation while they were in slavery in Egypt. They were delivered under Moses and his leadership. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and then they finally enter the promised land. And after a period of time, they reach their peak as a nation under King David and King Solomon. Solomon built that glorious temple. And then in the kingly administrations that followed, there was a long, slow decline that was fueled by a cycle of rebellion and then repentance and then more rebellion and then back to repentance again. And eventually the kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom, Israel, which was destroyed. So all that remained was the southern kingdom called Judah. Then Daniel, when he was a young man, as I said, just a young teenager, Nebuchadnezzar comes, and with very little effort, he destroyed all that was left of the nation that was to have been God's representatives in the world, his holy people. And if you're thinking, why would God allow that to happen? I remind you that the Hebrews, well, they just simply brought it upon themselves. They ignored the warnings that were given by God's prophets. I like what Warren Wiersbe says about this. He writes, God would rather have his people living in shameful captivity in a pagan land than living like pagans in the Holy Land and disgracing his name. Well, because of this, everything changed for Daniel. His dreams remained just that, just dreams. Dreams that quickly faded away like the morning mist. Contrary to his hopes, Daniel would come to adulthood and then spend his life in this foreign land. And instead of being served, he would give his service to an alien, a pagan king. But understand here, he lost much more than just his dreams. He lost his culture. He lost most of the relationships that he cherished in life, probably lost his parents, his siblings. He would have to learn a foreign language. In short, he would live and die in a place that he never wanted to be. He would never go home again. Daniel and his 3 friends would lose their names. And in this day, your name was very significant to you. Daniel's name literally meant the Lord will judge. So through his whole life, every time Daniel heard his name spoken, it was a reminder, it was a promise that the Lord will judge. He will set things right. The Lord will see that justice is done. But now, he's not Daniel anymore. He's given a new name, Belshazzar, which referred to a pagan Babylonian god, and the name meant Belshazzar will protect his life. Can you imagine how that felt for this godly young man to hear a pagan prayer every time his name is called? A prayer that made it look like that God wasn't calling the shots anymore. God wasn't in control of his life anymore. And the same was true for the renaming of the other 3. These new names that Nebuchadnezzar had given to them was a way of saying to them, you have a new king. You have a new religion. Give yourself to me and allow Babylon to define your identity. Well, the question I want to deal with this morning is simply this question. What do you and I do when we end up in the Babylons of life? It's an important question for us to answer because we all will end up in Babylon someday. There will be Babylon times for all of us. times when life doesn't turn out the way that we expected it to turn out. Remember, this is a fallen world that we live in, a world where one thing that we can expect in this world is the unexpected, the unfair, the unwanted. It will all happen. In some way or another, your dreams will fade and they'll be replaced by nightmares at times. So you need to decide, what will you do when these things happen in your life? What do you do when you find yourself like Daniel, stuck in Babylon? Lots of people are defeated by unexpected ordeals in life. When they find themselves in Babylon, they just wither in their spirit. They die on the inside. Others get through those tough times, but just barely. And interestingly enough, there are some, a minority, but some, who don't just survive in these traumatic times of life, they actually enlarge their capacity to handle problems and strengthen their ability to persist, even endure, and be creative in these times of life. They will actually grow in the midst of trauma. Well, Daniel was definitely one of these people. With God's help, he not only survived in Babylon, he thrived there. In fact, John Ortberg points out that in his study on this text, which I am deeply indebted to for this series, he points out the example that Daniel set and shows us three characteristics or three qualities that will help us to do the same thing in our own Babylons. So this morning, I want to look at those qualities. Here's the first characteristic we see in the way this remarkable young man, Daniel, responded to a huge, unexpected crisis in his life. Three characteristics we're going to look at that will help us thrive through the Babylons of life. Number one, he resolved to honor his God-given convictions. Daniel refused to live as a passive victim of circumstances that were beyond his control. He refused to get tangled up in stuff that would cause him to betray his deepest beliefs. In short, Daniel resolved to honor God. Look back at verse 8, and I want you to note that this is a very important verse. In fact, in many ways, this is the hinge for the entire book of Daniel. Everything in the book of Daniel begins to turn here. You see, up till this point, the Babylonians seemed to be in the driver's seat. And the easiest thing in the world would have been for Daniel to just accept his faith and become a victim of his circumstances. But here, Daniel decides, he resolves that enough is enough. He would not defile himself by participating in the plan that had been selected for him, that meal plan. So he went to the head of the school and he says he didn't want that diet. He didn't want all the meat. He didn't want the alcohol to drink at every meal. And please note, he made this decision before the food was ever put on the table. Before he would even be tempted by the smells of the feast, which would remind us, or should remind us, that we must do our own resolving. We must commit to follow our own convictions before temptation sets in, because by then it's usually too late. Well, the reason Daniel did this, the reason he refused this menu, was because he knew that the meat was from the king's table And if it was from the king's table, it would have been offered to a pagan god. And so sharing in that food would have been the same as honoring that false god. Plus, he knew that Nebuchadnezzar believed that by first offering his food and drink to these gods, he would receive special blessings. And Daniel did not want the king or anyone else to conclude that he and his friends had prospered physically and intellectually and spiritually because the food they ate and the wine they drank had been offered to pagan gods. They didn't want anyone to come to that conclusion. He did not want these pagan deities to be honored in any way whatsoever. And it appears as if these four men, they're the only ones of these choice Hebrews who drew the line in the sand. The rest, well, they gave in and they scoffed up all the meat and drank all the wine that was offered from the king's table. In any case, I want you to understand that it took a great deal of courage for Daniel to stand up like this. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar was not the kind of leader who would cut people a little bit of slack. Here's an example from his life to show you what I mean here. In 2 Kings chapter 25, a prophet by the name of Zedekiah, well, he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar captured Zedekiah and all of his family. He had his sons killed right before Zedekiah's eyes. And then he had Zedekiah's eyes cut out so that the last thing he saw was his sons being killed. That's who Daniel is dealing with here. But that doesn't bother Daniel. He remembered his real name and the message that it contained. He believed in his heart that God is the only true judge, and he resolves to honor God no matter what. Resilient people who survive and thrive in the Babylons of life are like this. They cling to their Christian convictions. They build their lives on God's loving laws, and they refuse to get tangled up in sin. And note that Daniel's people smarts, note those people smarts in the way that he went about this. He said, let's just try this for 10 days, sir. Then you be the judge. Just give us 10 days on this vegetable diet. He exercises amazing initiative and courage and tact, not to mention faith that God is going to work. And God did work miraculously. Because no health food diet will make that kind of difference in just 10 days. I can tell you from experience that diets take a lot longer than 10 days to work. If they all worked that fast, we'd all be skinny. But God did work. And the guard was so impressed at what happened to Daniel and his friends that he took everybody's steak and wine away, and he put the whole school on the health food diet. Okay, let me stop at this point and ask, is there anywhere in your life where you're getting tangled up in sin, ensnared by the world's ways? Has your Babylon pulled you into some activity that you know that God would not approve of? You and I would never purposely get ourselves involved in anything dangerous. And yet many of us might be willing to just kind of lean over to get a closer look at what the world has to offer. The world around us is littered with the mangled lives of men and women who never intended to get hooked on this, never intended to get involved in this sin in any way. They only wanted to get a closer look at the shiny colors of some of the forbidden sin. Some of the things the world has to offer are dangerous. Isn't that true? There's the husband who never intended to lose his family, but he decides it's okay to flirt around with the boundaries of adultery. And now he's pulling himself from the wreckage of a crashed marriage. Got tangled up in Babylon. There's the business person who decides that cutting an ethical corner here and there to make his pathway to the top a little bit quicker, a little bit easier. And now they're headed on a collision path that's waiting to happen. We get hooked up on the wrong road, the wrong path, and before we know it, we're feeling the pain of our little bit of sinful pleasure. We're desperate to ease the pain of our Babylon any way we can. And before long, we're feeling the hurt that always comes our way when we live contrary to God's will. I mean, so many people never intended to sin. But because they don't resolve, as Daniel did, resolve to stick with their convictions as a child of God, they allow themselves to get sucked in, pulled in. Listen, friends, the world is trying to tempt us to settle for less than God's best. We need to learn to simply say no. To plant our feet firmly and say, no, I'm going to be God's person. You'll never survive in the Babylons of life, much less thrive, until you make that decision. So Daniel resolved to honor his God-given convictions. Here's the second thing that Daniel did. Daniel committed to live in community with like-minded people. He knew that that he was a stranger living in a strange land, and he needed all the support that he could get. So he formed what I guess we could call the first ever believers small group with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They would go to school together. They would study, they would pray together, they would face decisions together. Listen, you can't handle the Babylons of life by yourself. You'll never survive, you'll never thrive outside of community. As Christians, we need each other. We really do. How very precious our Christian community is to us. I mean, in these places where community is difficult, people will move heaven and earth. They'll risk their lives just for a moment of community with their people. We need like-minded people to help us survive the tough times of life. Let me ask, are you in community with a group of Christians today? You need to be. You need the encouragement of others. You need someone to hold you accountable. You need their prayers on your behalf. You need their strength to lighten your burdens and the smiles to magnify your joys. You need other Christians to survive the Babylons of life. As someone put it, there are two things you can't do alone: be married and be a growing Christian. You need community. If you're not a member of Black Rock Baptist Church or some other gospel church, you need to join up. We'd love to have you with us. We'd love to see you involved in God's work. Well, there's one final quality that Daniel had, and that is that he believed that God is sovereign. His life, including the times of suffering in his life, had meaning and purpose, and he believed that. You know, researchers say that the main factor that causes people to to give up during the hard times, it's not the intensity of their suffering, but rather their belief that their suffering has no meaning. I mean, it's not the pain they go through that makes them give up. It's the meaninglessness of the pain. People who study this kind of thing find that people who give up on life rarely blame it on their failing health or rejection from others or finances or even physical pain. No. They say things like, well, there's no point in going on. There's no reason for me to keep living. Well, Daniel was different. He trusted in God's complete sovereignty. He knew that God always works for our good and for his glory, even in the midst of the Babylons of life. He knew there was purpose in his pain, and he was right. Our text shows us how much God was ready to work, was already at work, even when Daniel and his friends are going through this difficult time. Daniel believed in God's power and God's providence from the very beginning. He was convinced that even the defeat of Judah and the loss of the temple, which looked so tragic, it wasn't just a random, meaningless event to him. God was not sleeping. No, God was up to something in Babylon. Even in that place of great suffering, God was going to do something. He knew that this time of suffering in his life was the only thing that would turn some of his chosen people back to God. Plus, as it turned out, hindsight shows that God loved even the people of Babylon. He even loved Nebuchadnezzar and was reaching out to them in all of this. Listen, to survive and thrive in the Babylons of life, you have to know that God loves you, that he is all powerful, that he is always at work, that he wants to do something special in your life. You've got to know that. You've got to know that he's got it all under control. You've got to trust God's heart. You've got to believe he knows what he's doing and that there is purpose even in the midst of your pain. Daniel and his three friends knew all of this. And because they knew it, instead of being transformed by King Nebuchadnezzar and his people, they become transformers themselves. They joined God in his work, and he used them to bring great glory to his name, even in a pagan land. And we'll see as we continue in this study, their spiritual and political influence was enormous in the land. So the question we need to ask ourselves in our own Babylons of life, the question is not, how can I get out of this? But rather the question is, what can I get out of this? How can God use me, even in this situation? You know, Daniel outlived King Nebuchadnezzar. He outlived the king's successors and even the Babylonian Empire. He lived until the days of King Cyrus. And the thing that kept him going all those decades is that he knew that his God was more supreme than any king, than any ruler. As we conclude this first message in the series, I want us to resolve to do our best to emulate Daniel in his boldness. I want to ask you a couple of questions. First, are you willing to boldly say today that you are committed to living by your God-given convictions? You'll live that way. Will you pledge to never go against those convictions? Will you pledge to go against the flow, even if necessary? Even if everyone else is going a different direction, you will stand by your convictions. And will you say today that when the world tells you to do one thing and God tells you to do the opposite, you're going to obey God? Would you do that? Would you dare to be a Daniel? God bless. Have a great week. Join us again on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We'll continue to focus a little bit on Daniel this week in our short devotionals, and then we'll pick up and be looking at Daniel chapter 2 next week. God bless. Have a wonderful week. Let's continue to exchange prayers daily.